Thank you to Geoawesomeness and Regrid for inviting me today. Y'all should be worried that your last speaker is a standards nerd, but it's going to be more exciting than that, I promise. Again, Scott Simmons, I'm the Chief Standards Officer in OGC. And Nancy, that presentation was superb. It really was a great setup for me, not that I'm a robot, but rather that I want to talk at a more general level right now about land administration. Parcel data management is one aspect of overall land administration. What I want to talk about today are how the various standards, tools, and practices that are available to you now are helping ensure that you have confidence in the use of your land administration data for social, for economic, for political needs and means. And so I'm going to express that, one, with a little bit of background of what's out there, why we're doing the work, how the practices are evolved, and then a little bit more on demonstration of how this actually really works in the real world. Those of you not familiar with the Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC, we're an organization of 540 plus members, be them from commercial, government, research organizations, focused on one thing, and that's to make location information fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so all the context I provide today is really built around those principles. If you can't find your information, you can't use your information. Once you get your information, you start using it. If it's not interoperable and reusable, you've really wasted an awful lot of your money and time. And so that's really our mission, to ensure that all these pieces work well together. So let's start with a big question. Why should we standardize land information? If you're me, and I'm doing perfectly fine, I live in a very developed country, I have a nice salary, I live in a nice neighborhood, I can find my parcel data on a digital resource. This is the Land Information Locator here in Larimer County, Colorado. I have my exact parcel where my house is. There's confidence in the information around that parcel. There's a paper backup to it. There's a meets and bounds survey that was made every single time that parcel changed hands, and that whole legacy exists. When I want to make a commercial transaction, I want to sell my property, I have all of the confidence in the world that the information is adequate for me to do so. And I'm going to pay that small amount of money for a title insurance company to make sure it's all legal, but it's a small amount of money. I have confidence in this ownership of this property. I have confidence in my ability to do something with it. It's good for me economically. It's good for me socially. We also want to try to avoid loss of information. You've all seen land information in its original form. We had nice parcel books, plat maps, etc., in various parts of the world. The more developed the nation, perhaps the nicer those storage sheds were. But you also had this kind of situation where the information is collected, thrown in a pile, and eaten by insects. This kind of information does need to be preserved. We need to preserve this in a fashion that's understandable and suitable for the environment. And speaking of suitability, we have to do this for the people that need it most. One of the greatest ways to alleviate poverty is to give people land tenure. And in a lot of the world, we don't have the ability to go back to those records. The sophisticated nature of record keeping in some countries does not exist in others. That's not just because they didn't have the resources. It could also be social aspects. There are certainly parts of the world where the concept of land ownership is somewhat foreign to the people who inhabit the land. And so we have to make sure that we have a means to give these people access to the resources that they control. If you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 1 is to end poverty in the world. And if you look at the aspects of no poverty, how do you end poverty? One of the most important things is to give control over the land and secure tenure rights to those who have the land. And so that's a framing concept around any of the work we do internationally in our community on land administration, is that we ensure that we have this tenure. This is fundamental. It works really differently in different parts of the world. And this is where the complexity and where some of these issues with respect to what's the right standard, what's the right way to express this information needs to be discussed. And so let's take a look at that landscape. What standards are there out there that we can look at? By far the most important and the most commonly used and referenced is something referred to as LADM, the Land Information Domain Model. This is administered by ISO under their Technical Committee 211, Geographic Information, so ISO TC 211. A lot of you know it, you use their standards already. The current version was released in 2012. It's now under rework The way the original model was built, you had sort of a reference model, some land and water cases, and I'm going to come back to water again because that's really important, and these basic classes of information you need. The parties, who are the parties involved with the land tenure itself? What are the rights, responsibilities, and restrictions around that piece of land that's described? And the spatial units, how do you represent those spatial units in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions? There's some terminology that are enabling the communication amongst the parties to exchange information, and really very important, formal or informal practices. So the understanding that some communities don't have formal land registration practices, they're informal, and how do you address those when you're characterizing that land? And then finally, the ability to profile this standard to make it suitable for national or regional profiles, a very important sort of subset of it. You see just in the illustration there, that difference between the formality, informal to formal land rights, and hopefully that's clear to everyone. And you certainly can, in your own communities, understand where you are in that spectrum. LADM is currently being revised and being broken into a 6-part standard at the moment. The intent there is to make implementation of the standard simpler, to better address the dynamic nature of the environment in which we're working with land information and how communities are addressing these topics, and to be better suited for what's referred to as fit-for-purpose land administration. And here comes the first giant asterisk in my discussion. This is a really controversial topic. If you think about land administration from the perspective we've just seen today, on a highly developed nation like the United States, that may have that weird problem of over 3,000 counties, each independently administering their own land records, we can still perhaps agree, as Nancy described, on that the standard isn't just important, it's the common usage of the standard so we can actually exchange information. We can perhaps come to those agreements. We do have a problem in a highly federal government like the United States or India or Australia, where each subset of the nation, the state or whatever, or territory, may choose to operate in a different way, and then it has to deal internally with its own divisions that themselves may operate differently. But we can expect some degree of collaboration and standardization if we do things right. Other areas of the world, you just don't have these options. When you look at a fit-for-purpose model and you're working in a developing nation where 2 farmers have had multi-generations of families farming the same land, and they've divided that land by 2 rocks at each corner of their fields. Those 2 rocks are the fit-for-purpose description of where that boundary is. And we have to have a way to capture that and ensure that even that information is somewhat permanent and non-negotiable, because some farmer's son is going to go out there and move a rock and grab a little more land in the future. Everyone's greedy everywhere in the world. So we have to ensure that we have this fit-for-purpose assessment in our standardization. I also want to highlight this 3rd part on marine space geolocation, which links to the International Hydrographic Organization standard S121, which is a standard for marine limits and boundaries, because I'm going to come back to that as an example of how we can test and prove these systems work. OGC has published a suite of standards referred to as the Land Infra GML standards, and these standards are focused on really what information is necessary to describe infrastructure. That means the built environment, but that also needs to tie back to the land parcels, the land ownership, the land administration, because you can't develop infrastructure if you don't understand who the heck owns it. And you'll see some concepts here of a land division, equivalent to a parcel, and even condominiums because of their really weird nature of how they're actually owned and operated from an administrative standpoint. And so if you look at the conceptual model for land infra, you have this overarching concept of putting together the features of the land, the facilities built on the land, alignments of elements, survey data, and then in the purplish color on the right on the part 7, land divisions and land condominiums. Those are all tightly integrated with all the other infrastructure that we're describing. So if you're describing a railway, that railway crosses some number of land division elements, and we have to ensure that all those are standardized and linked and you understand the relationships. And if we then break that into its implementation, so this standard is a conceptual model, it has an implementation as well, and these implementations break into substandards to handle each of those elements you saw, and one of those substandards is for land division information. The land division information links directly back to LADM. And so again, in the standards community, we're collaborating and ensuring that those means that are most often used by one community can be addressed by others. So those people designing infrastructure, making new roads, have an access back to that cadastral information that might be stored in LADM. And speaking of cadastry, there is also a thesaurus of terminology for cadastral information that OGC is hosting on behalf of the land administration community. So all of the vocabulary used for describing land administration data, parcel data, and LADM, as well as the land infra standards, are as part of this vocabulary and accessible to you from OGC's definition server, which shows you a lot of the information on these various definitions. So again, we've got now consistent vocabulary, consistent terminology, because it's really impossible to talk about those aspects of land administration unless we talk in the same language. Land administration is a 3D problem as well, right? So every high-rise, particularly if it's a high-rise that's owned as individual flats or condominiums, whatever they might be, each of those elements in three-dimensional space has importance from an administrative standpoint. And so OGC's City GML standard has been used by a number of communities to develop 3D cadastre. And you're seeing this in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands right now, where three-dimensional cadastral information is linked with other urban information and readily accessible, queryable, etc. And that's really important, because when you look at this view from this flat, that view is money. The reason you have 3D cadastral information is not really to make society a greater place. It's because real estate transactions are often based on view sheds. And that 3D cadastral information in the view shed from that cadastre is critically important. All the time, economics come back to drive these things. Yes, in a lot of developing nations, this is not as much of an issue as we have to face. But in highly developed urban environments, it's one of the most critical cases of all. OGC did a study a number of years ago on what are the drivers for creating 2D and 3D data sets. And when we talked about 3D data sets, the example came to us from Seoul, South Korea, that 3D real estate is the most important real estate in the world for them. Well, we have all these standards, but now how do we put them together? How do we try to bring our community together to use this information in a consistent manner, in a repeatable manner, in a manner where expertise can be driven upwards? So, oops, sorry, too many clicks there. So there is a white paper available on land administration published by the OGC a couple of years ago. This involved contributions from the community that's currently writing the LADM revision, as well as the original standard, the land and infrastructure standards at OGC, practitioners from universities around the world. And it really dives into a lot of the details about land administration systems, what type of systems are available, which ones have been successful, what nations are doing really good work, where we need help, brings straight to the forefront the controversy around fitness for purpose, where some people really love it because it helps get these problems addressed in the developing world. Other people, more developed nations, are terrified that fit for purpose data means slack and crummy data. Really important considerations, so we bring that to the forefront. So a good place to learn a lot about how to handle this administration. With support from the UN Habitat, the Global Land Tool Network is available, talking a lot about every aspect of land tenure, land administration, as it develops to socioeconomic development of a nation or a subpart of that nation. And so the GLTN is really a useful tool set. Linked to the GLTN is a social tenure domain model. Again, another model to describe land tenure in the way that is most suitable for the conditions available in that location. If you look at the supporting documents at the bottom of this diagram, sketches, audio, video, whatever kind of information you can get that helps describe that information, at least now here's a model to put this information together and give us some aspect of consistency in how we describe land and land administration. And so what I'd like to finish with is to talk, I'm just going to give one quick example of proving this work out, because ultimately it's great to talk about these standards. It's wonderful to say that we've got all these practices in place and people are doing them, but we've got to test them. We need to test them as fairly as we can. And so there was a really fun project, and I'm only talking about this one because I got really involved and loved it. There's plenty of others to use as examples. But the International Hydrographic Organization, IHO, and OGC jointly ran what we referred to as our Marine Limits and Boundaries pilot. And our idea was to take a look at this very complicated S121 standard that describes the limits and boundaries in the marine space, which is linked directly again to LADM. So it does have the linkages to land tenure, but it's a stranger and more interesting use case. So we're talking about marine limits and boundaries. When you think of your parcel data, you often think about the beach as the end of that. But think about this from a national or a subnational standpoint. Nations own offshore rights. They own fishing rights. They own volumetric rights. They own a certain volume of the water for certain types of fishing. They own subsurface rights below the surface of the sea floor. So an oil and gas company can lease a chunk of the sea floor and have access to some volume of oil and gas underneath that parcel, if you will, stuck to the sea floor. It's the same problem set we face on land, complicated much more frequently by the fact that it's highly contested in many parts of the world. And so what we did in this project was to demonstrate that, one, the basic information could be collected from a number of nations. Two, that information could be shared in super sophisticated GIS fashion, like you see at this picture from FME, from Safe Software, highlighting the actual GML, OGC's geography markup language, which is a really complicated way to describe anything. But that same information could go right to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Limits of the Sea, to publish information for sharing between nations so that they can agree on common information and common boundary data sets. And so it's a proof that not only the content can be managed in the forms where the experts need it the most, the geospatial professionals getting to manage this just as you see on the screen with little polygons, the lawyers getting to see a survey data set in descriptive word language that never actually considers the actual geography or projection of the data and all those other things. And then various nations having a common baseline against which to share their content, contrast their data, and argue over it, if you will. And so we can prove out these things work. We can show that the content is quite portable by using the right standards. The big issue now is really how do we in our community ensure that we develop these practices that we're going to share across the board with other members of our community in a consistent fashion. And so with that, I'll leave it open to any questions you might have. You can find me at ssimmons@ogc.org or on the OGC website. Happy to answer anything or provide any further information.